Diana, the global icon who captured the heart of a nation.
She's here now.
But behind the dazzling princess was a girl haunted by a cursed childhood.
Diana, till her dying day, thought that she was the child that they didn't want around, that she was the unwanted child.
In this film, we explore the tragic story of Diana's parents and her upbringing, revealing how a litany of tragedies from her past influenced her royal future.
It really was a case of history repeating itself.
From her mother's devastating loss of a baby boy,
she was never allowed to hold her first son,
to the damage wreaked by her parents' bitter divorce.
That was a seminal moment for Diana, and she felt a profound and enduring sense of abandonment.
From the arrival of a controlling stepmother,
Diana said to her face, I hate you for everything you've done to my family.
To the death of an earl, a father she loved.
Suddenly it wasn't the Princess of Wales, it was a woman that was really upset and distressed.
This is the story of Diana and a family whose lives were littered with pain and tragedy, told by those who knew them.
She was a prisoner in her own home.
Diana, Princess of Wales, has been seriously injured.
With a daughter that was between life and death, going out of her mind.
Late summer, 1981, the wedding of the century. The fairy tale princess who married her prince. As Lady Diana Spencer emerged, she'd already captured the world's imagination.
Isn't it fairy tale?
But as nearly 1 billion people watched her every move, very few were aware of the story beneath the glittering facade.
When Diana walked down the aisle with her father, Earl Spencer, clinging to her side, the whole world was focused on this magical princess, and nobody really took much notice of the Spencer family. In every film, there's a backstory, and her background had made her who she was.
Surrounded by her family, Diana was embarking on a relationship that was destined to come crashing down in full view of the public.
I, Diana Frances.
Hi, Diana Frances.
Just like her parents' marriage 30 years before. The story of Diana's parents, Frances and Johnny Spencer, began in the aristocratic circles of 1950s London. A whirlwind of dashing bachelors and dazzling debutantes.
Wonderful.
And from the beginning, their love story had parallels to Diana's own. Just as Prince Charles was the most eligible bachelor of the 1970s aristocracy, so Johnny Spencer was the catch of the county.
He was the heir to an earldom, he was a dashing viscount, he'd been to Eton, and he was part of the royal entourage.
The Spencer family had been servants of the crown going back generations. Johnny Spencer himself was an equerry to King George VI, and he was an integral part of the royal machinery, if you like.
Johnny Spencer was heir to the rolling acres of Altrop Hall in Northamptonshire. Mothers looking for husbands for their daughters would have put Johnny pretty well at the top of the list.
But making a suitable match wasn't just about falling in love. It was a cutthroat business.
This is a finishing school for girls in London.
Teach them about fashion, about grooming, how to press their clothes, everything, really.
Women of that stock, there is nothing they like better than planning for a match not made in heaven, made in the drawing rooms of the landed aristocracy.
It was in this fiercely competitive world that Viscount Spencer first fell in love, but not with Diana's mother. The focus of his attentions was Lady Anne Coke, an earl's daughter and future maid of honour at the Queen's coronation. She seemed perfect marriage material.
She's part of the family of the Earl of Leicester, so she's in with the right set. She has her great coming out party, she meets Johnny, very quickly he's down on bended knee.
The engagement was kept secret, but behind the scenes, not everyone was enthusiastic about the match.
Jack Spencer, Johnny's father, was a formidable figure, a very clever man. I think today people would say he didn't suffer fools gladly, and those fools would include his son and heir, Johnny, who found him, I think, quite a terrifying figure.
Jack and Johnny did not get on. He was openly disappointed with his son, and he didn't think he was very bright.
With Johnny nearing 30, his father was impatient for him to produce a male heir. So the news of his son's engagement should have made him happy, but instead he opposed the match.
Earl Spencer was worried that she had in her family what he called mad Trefusis blood. She was distantly related to the Trefusis family, and that there was a genetic condition that resulted in, over the years, one or two people in that family having various mental disabilities.
Johnny's father found her just totally unsuitable. He absolutely was determined that Johnny shouldn't have anything to do with her.
And the Earl wasn't the only obstacle to the match. Other powerful forces were at play. Lady Anne happened to be a lodger of Lady Ruth Fermoy, the aristocrat who would become Diana's grandmother, and Lady Fermoy had ambitions for her own daughter, Frances.
Diana's maternal grandmother, Ruth Fermoy, after having her children, she then devoted herself to royal service. She became one of the Queen Mother's women of the bedchamber. That was a very, very powerful friendship. So Ruth Fermoy was devoted to her family, but also to the service of the royal family.
When Lady Fermoy found out that Anne was seeing Viscount Spencer, she seized the opportunity to push her own daughter, Frances, to the fore.
What do you do if you're an ambitious mother and you hear that your pipsqueak of a lodger is marrying the most eligible man in England? You get your daughter, Frances, age 15, out of her boarding school, into the drawing room to be present when Johnny's there with his girlfriend Anne. And that's precisely what Ruth Fermoy does.
It was at this genteel meeting that the destiny of 3 generations of women who would go on to indelibly shape the British monarchy was set in motion.
Is it true love at first sight? Certainly something. There was some frisson of some sort, because Anne doesn't ever get Johnny down the aisle, and Frances does.
Not long after Lady Fermoy's fateful tea, Lady Anne was invited to attend Ascot with the royal family. And it was here that she realised things with her dashing fiancé had gone very wrong.
She gets very excited, steals one of her mum's servant girls to help her with all her poofy dresses for the 4 days of Ascot, and then he doesn't turn up. In those days, the term ghosting wasn't around, but effectively that's what he did.
In the end, Viscount Spencer had bowed to family pressure.
Johnny was a sort of dutiful son. He might not get on with his father, but he certainly wasn't going to create some huge family schism.
Within 4 years of their first meeting, Johnny had proposed to Frances. And in 1954, their wedding was the talk of the town.
Westminster Abbey was certainly a perfect setting, the wedding of the year.
Frances had made it. She'd snagged an earl, which is the ideal for every nice young girl.
The wedding of Viscount Althorp and his bride, Frances Roche, was attended by the American ambassador, Mr. Winthrop Aldrich. And now the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret arrived for the great occasion.
Frances's mother, Ruth Lady Fermoy, she'd made it. Not only was she one of the most senior ladies-in-waiting to the Queen Mother, but her daughter now had married the catch of the county.
For the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, it was the first big social engagement since their return to this country.
It's a big moment. The Queen is there. The royal family turn out for this because they know the young Lord Althorp. He's part of the court, and their friends are royal friends. So it's very much an aristocratic gathering.
And here are the pages and the bridesmaids. Finally, the bride herself, in a gown of white fy, embroidered with diamante and sequins.
Her dress was covered with crystals and pearls and hand-cut diamonds. It must have been worth an absolute fortune.
As Diana's mother entered the abbey, a sea of faces, hundreds of whom she'd never even met, turned to get a glimpse of the blushing bride.
The Royal Scots Greys made an arch of swords for Viscount Althorp and his bride as they came up.
And she looked very pretty, very young and very pretty.
Three decades later, history was about to repeat itself, with tragic consequences. Just as Diana's mother Frances was steered into meeting her Viscount, her daughter met her prince. She too was only a teenager. Charles was 12 years her senior, and he, like Johnny Spencer, had already been in love. The prince met Camilla Parker Bowles in the 1970s, and they seemed ideally suited. But just as Viscount Spencer had faced family pressure not to marry Lady Anne, so it's claimed Charles's choice of Camilla was met with some disapproval.
His great uncle, Lord Mountbatten, was absolutely shocked that he was thinking of her in a serious way. She'd had various boyfriends, and the heir to the throne at that time could not even consider having someone who wasn't pure.
He was brought up on the Mountbatten rulebook, which was some girls are for fun, and some girls, ideally young and virginal, are for breeding. And Camilla fell into the former, not the latter.
And just as Earl Spencer's relationship with his girlfriend Anne had been quashed, so some believe Charles's romance was similarly interrupted.
Lord Mountbatten arranged for Charles to go off on a long sea trip. He was in the Navy, and he hoped that during the 8 months that he would be away, he would forget all about her.
Charles adored her, but as is the way in these things, he went off to sea in the Royal Navy, and she felt she wanted a secure future, and so she married Andrew Parker Bowles.
With Camilla out of the picture, a more suitable match urgently had to be found.
He was being nagged by his parents because they felt it's very important for him to have an heir to the throne. And he wasn't going in the right direction.
Charles had already dated Diana's sister Sarah, but in 1980, his attentions turned to Diana when they met at a weekend organised by a mutual friend. And just as when Viscount Spencer met Frances, this time it seemed Charles couldn't have found a more perfect match.
Diana would make the family thought of very highly, bring a lot of prestige to them, and they knew that Diana was pure, so they encouraged that enormously.
Just like her mother before her, Diana was deemed to be perfect wife material.
She somehow was seen as the sort of cream of Englishness, coming from this ancient family, but working in West London. There was a girl next door quality about her. She seemed unsullied and pure and sweet, so she somehow touches lots and lots of bases.
Less than a year after starting their courtship, Diana and Charles would walk down the aisle, 30 years after Diana's mother and father had done the same. As the blushing brides faced the crowds, their toughest job was yet to come. They would have to produce a male heir. For Frances, the need to have a son would lead to the ultimate heartbreak and change all of their lives forever.
When the baby was born, tragically he only survived for 10 hours.
I think it was devastating. I don't think the pain of that ever left her.
Princess Diana was a global icon, loved by the world. But although millions followed her every move, behind the confident woman lay memories of a difficult childhood. Before she was even born, her parents suffered a terrible tragedy that was to shape all of their lives. When the newlywed Viscount and Viscountess Spencer drove home from their honeymoon, Frances was already pregnant.
I think perhaps at this point, Frances, who's a bright girl, is realising that Johnny is sort of worryingly beholden to this legacy that he's expected to fulfil, to become the 8th Earl, to deliver the heir, to do what the Spencer clan has always done.
The Spencers' ancestral seat was Althorpe in Northamptonshire, which Johnny would eventually inherit. But in 1954, it was still home to his gruff and domineering father.
Within any dynastic institution, be it a family business or an aristocratic family with big estates, big issues in terms of who inherits what, the imperative is to produce an heir. I mean, that's absolutely crucial. And Jack Spencer, he had one son, John. He had to get it right. He didn't want the line going off to a distant cousin. So there was great pressure on Johnny, who needed a son.
In March 1955, Frances had her first child. But it wasn't the male heir her father-in-law wanted. It was a girl, Sarah Spencer, Diana's older sister. And 2 years later, another daughter followed, Cynthia Jane.
Once she'd produced 2 girls for Johnny, he was really demanding a boy.
And it wasn't just the Spencers who were alarmed. Frances's mother, Lady Fermoy, knew that without a boy, the social standing she'd fought to achieve for her daughter would come to nothing.
The necessity to produce a male heir for Frances was something which ate away at her soul. And the whole family, her mother, Jack, her husband, Johnny, all thought there was something wrong with her.
Finally, Frances got pregnant again, and hopes for a boy were high. It was decided that she would give birth at home. On the 12th of January 1960, she had a son, John Spencer.
When the baby was born and Frances and then Johnny were told that it was a little boy, they were absolutely over the moon. They were so happy, and it was of huge relief to Frances that she'd done her duty.
But their happiness was short-lived.
There were breathing difficulties, and I think they sort of whipped him away to try and save him. She regretted not having to hold him longer, without a doubt. But I don't know what there may have been good medical reasons why that was the case. From a mother's perspective, it may be different to a medical perspective.
10 hours later, her son John died. Frances asked to be able to hold him, but her request was denied.
She retrospectively said that she minded enormously that she was never allowed to hold or see her first son. And I think that almost any woman who's lost a baby or can even imagine losing a baby would understand that sentiment.
I think it was devastating. I think it had as it would for any mother losing a child. I think to lose a child must be the hardest pain of all.
Frances was quite sort of emotional and poetic almost about the impact of that loss later in life. And what struck me was just how the crib was wheeled away and the baby clothes that were to be were packaged up.
When she talked about her children, she would often mention John. She always saw herself as a mother of 5 children. The world may have not readily recognised that she had this child that she'd lost, but she never forgot. I don't think the pain of that ever left her.
The interesting thing is that Johnny didn't want to talk about it, and I think he forbid Frances to talk about it either. So they couldn't actually make amends or make it clear or cry and feel a bit better or comfort each other. It was a very harsh event and very sad for both of them.
Whilst Frances was still recovering, her mother and her husband were determined to find out not only why John had died, but why she was unable to have a boy.
The pressure was now on to produce a healthy male heir, and to that end she was sent to various clinics in Harley Street, Wimpole Street, prodded and poked in the most intimate of areas by gynecologists, doctors, and all the time this sense of guilt that she was some kind of a failure, which of course she wasn't, because as we now know, the sex of a child is defined by the male, not the female.
It was in this fraught atmosphere that Frances conceived again. And on the 1st of July 1963, Diana was born. A third girl.
And there was widespread dismay because they were all anxious that it would be a baby boy. And Diana, till her dying day, thought that she was the unwanted child.
A year later, in 1964, the long-awaited male Spencer heir arrived with the birth of Charles. But it was too late for Frances and Johnny's marriage. The damage was done.
Frances gave birth to a boy, Charles, who was very healthy, and she was absolutely thrilled. Johnny was thrilled, but the marriage was already in a very bad way.
The atmosphere between Johnny and Frances was poisonous. They could barely stand one another. Arguments were vicious.
He would shout at her and scream at her. And little Diana used to look through the banister and she could see him being really horrible and making her mother cry.
And Diana remembered on one occasion she saw her father slap Frances during one argument as she watched from behind a door. And that had a profound effect on her.
She always remembered that, and it upset her. It made her feel very unstable.
Nearly 20 years after Diana had witnessed the painful impact of her mother's struggle to have a male heir, she, like Frances, fell pregnant in the first months of her marriage, and within a year, gave birth to her first child, a baby boy. For Frances, it was a moment for celebration.
Mid-morning, and the princess's sister and her mother arrived. With typical discretion, they slipped quietly into the hospital.
Frances is utterly overjoyed. She's worried about the relationship between Charles and Diana. She's worried about the vulnerability of her daughter, and she knows what the pressure to deliver an heir is like, let alone the heir to the throne.
She spoke to me as she left, and it was clear that she was well pleased with what she'd seen in the hospital. How did Princess Diana look when you saw her?
She looked radiant, absolutely radiant.
There must have been a sense of great relief on Frances' part that her daughter might not have to go through the constant ups and downs of childbirth, because her very first child was a boy, William, had secured the line to the throne, and anything that came afterwards was a bonus.
A grandson is everything that his father said last night. Lovely baby.
And how's the prince?
Very happy. A lot of happiness up there.
So the fact that Diana was able to do that in her very first pregnancy, Frances felt would take off a lot of pressure on her in the future. Life could be a lot easier.
Earl Spencer. Good morning, sir. Can you tell us how you're...
Good morning. How is she? Very well indeed, thank you. Looks beautiful. Looks to be a lovely baby, too. Really super baby, you know? It's good news.
2 years later, Diana had a second boy. With an heir and another healthy son, Diana had fulfilled her royal duties. But if Frances hoped having 2 boys would ensure her daughter's marriage would succeed where her own had failed, she was wrong.
At the entrance to Kensington Palace, the prince and princess and their baby arrived from the hospital at speed.
Well, we only have the Diana version of events, that Charles came in and saw that it was a boy and that he'd got sort of reddish, sandy, Spencer-coloured hair, and is supposed to have said, oh, it's a boy, and it's sort of with disappointment, and promptly left.
Then, less than an hour later, Prince Charles left to play polo, something most new fathers would hardly dare to suggest.
In fact, having 2 boys, rather than saving Charles and Diana's marriage, only made things worse.
Frances Shankidd, her mother, was talking to Prince Charles, and he said, he'd wished that baby had been a girl and not a boy, because he always wanted a girl. And Frances snaps at him, you should be grateful that you just got a healthy child, after what, and really it was a fairly crass remark, given what had happened to her.
It was an insensitivity that infuriated Frances. She knew only too well that the loss of her son and the pressures she'd endured to have a boy had eaten away at her marriage. Nearly 2 decades earlier in 1967, 3 years after the birth of her younger son, events were about to unfold that would trigger a scandal and a reputation that would haunt her.
Frances was now known as a bolter, someone who had left the family and gone off with another man.
It had a huge effect on her. Diana didn't know how long her mother had gone for or when she would see her again.
After the birth of Prince Harry in the mid-1980s, Diana's marriage was breaking down for all the world to see.
When I asked Diana, where did it all go wrong, she always pinpointed the occasion of the birth of Prince Harry. She always noted that as being the beginning of the end.
2 decades earlier, her parents' marriage was about to hit the rocks. Within a few years of having her children, Diana's mother began an affair.
Frances got so bored with her husband that she decided that she would go to London and join dinner parties and have a nice time because she was fed up with it. So she went to various dinners, and on one of them, she met Peter Shankidd.
Peter Shankidd was the heir to a wallpaper company. He and Frances met when both couples were still married to their respective partners, and it wasn't long before the two started an affair.
After the tensions of the past 5 years, time with Peter came as a welcomed relief.
It wasn't love at first sight, but his sense of humour clearly resonated with hers. And she liked a good joke, and she could tell a good joke, most of them unrepeatable. And I think he had a sense of humour that she bonded with.
I think he was everything that Spencer wasn't. He was outgoing, he was larger than life, he was an enthusiast.
Here was a tall, handsome man who showed a lot of interest in her.
But the affair didn't stay secret. And when Johnny Spencer found out about his wife and Peter, things escalated very quickly.
When Johnny discovered that his wife was having an affair, he was furious. Not just for himself so much, but for the family name. He did not want the Spencer name dragged through the mud.
So it was very, very humiliating, and he sunk into a terrible depression.
Frances decided to leave Johnny. Whilst her 2 eldest daughters were at boarding school, she took Diana and Charles with her to London.
Well, I think she'd reached the end of putting up with what she felt was a marriage that had a lot of turmoil in it. She'd found somebody else who offered her a different, happier life.
But if Johnny and Frances had hoped for a low-profile separation to avoid a scandal, events took a turn for the worse. Peter Shankidd left his wife, and Frances was named publicly as the other woman in their divorce. Suddenly, the state of the Spencer marriage was public knowledge, and matters were about to come to a head. December 1967, and a Christmas that neither Diana or her mother would ever forget. Over the holiday, Frances and the children returned to the family home for a brief visit, so they could be together with their father to celebrate.
The trouble came when Christmas emerged, and the idea was that she would come back and all the children would be together with their parents at Park House. Unfortunately, the relationship between Frances and Johnny was so terrible that they couldn't hide their dislike of each other.
During the holiday, Frances took the opportunity to ask Johnny for a divorce.
In those times, it was absolutely not on that you had a divorce. So it was shocking. He knew how shameful it was for a courtier like him, who looked up to the royal family for good behaviour, to have a divorce on his lap. And Johnny was absolutely livid with her.
As Frances prepared to return to London, Johnny refused to let her take the children with her. She had no choice but to leave them behind.
She was absolutely shocked and heartbroken, and I think Johnny did it out of spite, and he was just furious that she'd brought the name of the family down so much.
Her mother leaving was a moment that haunted Diana for the rest of her life.
Diana carried in her mind's eye an image of what happened that fateful day. And when she spoke to me 25 years later, that day, those memories were still vivid and still endured. She was sat on the stone step, clinging to a balustrade. Her mother crunched across the gravel, got into a car. Luggage was loaded into the boot of the car, and she drove off. As Diana felt, out of her life forever. So that was a seminal moment for Diana, a moment that lived with her, not just through her childhood, but well into her adult life. And she felt a profound and enduring sense of abandonment.
The experience left Diana determined never to repeat her parents' mistakes, and she saw firsthand the devastation it wreaked on her father.
Johnny's reaction to Frances leaving was to become more isolated. He would occupy one wing of the house, leave Charles and Diana in the other wing. Diana and Charles were terrified of the dark. Diana would recall that she'd hear her little brother crying at night, but was too scared to go and comfort him. As far as Johnny was concerned, as far as the Norfolk set were concerned, her mother was now known as a bolter, someone who had left the family. And this myth of the bolter stayed with Diana throughout her life.
But Frances wasn't going to let matters lie. A custody trial was about to unfold that would shake high society and lead to a devastating betrayal.
When you're rejected not just by your ex-husband, but by your own kith and kin, the woman who gave birth to you, that's painful.
When Diana was a child, her parents' marriage broke down and her mother left the family home. It was a moment that lived with Diana into her adult life. The events of her parents' divorce that followed would have a lasting impact. Not long after Diana's mother, Frances, had been forced to leave her children, she filed for custody, and the court case that followed would reveal just how ruthless an aristocracy under attack could be.
So she's publicly, legally, the adulterer. So she's the baddie versus Johnny's goodie in terms of the perception and legal binding of this case. And therefore, the idea that she's then going to win the children, doesn't matter what the children need, doesn't matter what Frances wants.
The aim, I think, of Johnny's in court was to prove that he could look after them and that his wife could not. She was not suitable to do that because, after all, she's had an affair with a rather ordinary man, whereas he has very good connections. He got a load of top aristocrats who appeared in court and put him forward as the man who should have the children and that Frances shouldn't.
And Johnny's final victory was secured by the ultimate betrayal. The woman who'd first brought Johnny and Frances together now served the final blow in ripping their family apart.
The clincher is when Lady Fermoy Francis's mother, Diana's grandmother, speaks out against her own daughter and recommends the children should stay with her son-in-law, Johnny.
What was shocking was that Lady Fermoy criticised her daughter, and she said that she felt that Johnny would be a much better father than her own daughter would be as a mother. She was horrified that she'd had an affair.
I suspect that Lady Fermoy, born in 1908, an establishment figure, probably believed that divorce was wrong, and she probably believed that there might be a more stable home for the children with their father than with their mother, since the mother had precipitately ended the marriage. But it seems very harsh now.
Frances said that Ruth told her that if she'd run off with a duke, that would have been okay. But this was different. And Frances said, that may have been funny, she said, but at least I would have got my children.
The judge decided in favour of Johnny. When she heard the verdict, Frances collapsed in court.
I think it had a shattering effect on Frances. Motherhood was everything to her, and she was being denied that role.
It doesn't matter all the stuff about whether Frances got on with Johnny or fell in love with Peter. What Frances will have known at the end of that court case, that actually she no longer has custody to her children. That's a devastating blow, and one that you're never going to recover fully from.
Frances was accused of being a bolter, and she felt that reputation was totally undeserved, and I think with total justification. She always said that the children were taken from her, not the other way round. She did not leave her children.
She fell out with her mother. She'd obviously fallen out with her ex-husband, and she didn't know yet what this whole drama was going to have on her relationship with her own children.
She said that she forgave her in the end, but I'm not sure deep down Frances ever really forgave her.
In the spring of 1969, Frances and Johnny's divorce was granted on the grounds of adultery. Within 2 years, Frances had lost her children, become a social pariah, and been betrayed by her own mother.
In terms of the Spencer family, in terms of Norfolk society, Frances was deemed to be the bolter, the woman who had left her husband, left her children, and gone off with another man. As a child, Diana didn't understand what a bolter was. She just felt that she'd been left by her mother. But as Diana became an adult and understood the nuances of marriage, she realised that her mother had been cruelly castigated and that there was wrong on both sides. It wasn't just Frances's fault. And when she and Prince Charles were separated, a newspaper talked about Diana being a bolter, just like her mother. And I'll never forget, that was one of the most profoundly affecting descriptions that Diana had ever had. She was deeply hurt by it, deeply upset, because she knew that her mother wasn't a bolter. Now she understood as an adult, that her mother had been forced to give up the custody of the children.
23 years after her mother's divorce from Viscount Spencer, Diana's marriage to Charles had broken down.
I think it'd been pretty bad from the beginning, so, you know, what chance did this marriage have from day one? But Diana was desperately keen to make it work. You know, she was fully aware of the relationship with Camilla and, you know, naively believed that they'd all go away and we'll live happily ever after. But of course, that didn't happen.
It is announced from Buckingham Palace that with regret, the Prince and Princess of Wales have decided to separate. Their Royal Highnesses have no plans to divorce, and their constitutional positions are unaffected.
The separation marked the start of a 4-year, very public media relations war.
From the moment of the Prince and Princess of Wales' separation, they began lobbing grenades, if you like, at each other. And it was waged between their advisors and their friends. And it was a PR battle of sorts.
In 1995, Diana decided to do an interview with Panorama presenter Martin Bashir.
She didn't tell me. She certainly didn't tell her mother. On the day that she decided to inform the royal family that she had made this film, she then let the secret out with a number of close friends and family. I was one of the people she called and told me, so I think that's the most that anybody knew in advance.
Francis, like more than 20 million others, watched the interview at home.
Diana, during the Panorama interview, was quite explicit. She said that she'd been through the divorce as a child and she didn't want to go through it again.
Well, she was against divorce, I think, because of her own childhood memories of what had happened to her parents and her brothers and sister as a result of her parents splitting up. And she was determined, in her mind, to keep the artifice of the marriage going for as long as possible.
Diana also took the opportunity to criticize her own husband.
She questioned really whether Charles was suitable to be king. So that was really an attack on the monarchy.
As her daughter bared her soul, not in a courtroom, but in the full glare of the world's media, Francis may well have feared what royal retribution might follow.
Frances Young Kidd watched the Panorama interview from her Scottish redoubt. And I think that what would have been going through her own mind is that life imitates life. She was watching her daughter's experience, reflecting her own experience.
In fact, before Diana did the Panorama interview, she, like Francis, had been on the receiving end of criticism from her husband's friends.
People like Nicholas Soames, a good friend of the Prince, who went on national television to say that Diana, was in the early stages of paranoia. Lady Kennard, a friend of the Queen, saying that she was damaged goods. All these things that were trying to point a way to say, look, it's nothing to do with the princess, all to do with Diana, which was totally wrong.
And like her mother, one of Diana's fears was the potential of losing her children.
Very much in the early stages of the separation, I think she had a genuine fear that the royal family might try and extract the children, if you like, from the marriage and make Charles the sole custodian of the boys in the same way all those years previously, Johnny Spencer had been made the custodian of the 4 Spencer children.
The savage irony is that Diana found herself reliving her mother's trauma, because the one thing that she was terrified of was William and Harry being taken away from her losing custody. And it's the thing she said over and over again. And she even considered flying them to Australia, to a place of safe haven. She knew full well that being in line to the throne, their lives were not their own. And she felt that, like her mother, she could lose custody to a powerful family.
But whereas Frances was overwhelmed in the custody trial by an aristocracy who rallied against her and was accused of abandoning her family, there's new evidence from the man Diana was seeing when she did the Panorama interview, Hasnat Khan, that suggests she might have had a plan.
Hasnat Khan was very much around in the early stages of the planning of the interview. He wasn't intimately involved, but he knew a great deal, more than anyone else. He told me last year that Diana had a strategy in doing the interview, and she calculated, as Hasnat Khan said, that in giving this interview, she would provoke Charles or the royal family into pushing ahead for a divorce, which she could then say to the public she never sought and didn't want. Now that's a very interesting take, because no one's ever come up with that before. It's inconceivable that somewhere at the back of her mind, she hadn't lodged away what had happened to Frances and how she was determined it wasn't going to happen to her.
Within a month of giving the interview, Diana received a letter from the Queen.
I think the Queen was not in the habit of writing letters to relatives, and at first there was no response, but I think within 3 or 4 weeks the Queen wrote to Charles and Diana and said, really, this is it. I think that you need to start talking about divorce, because I think that the Panorama interview made the fact that they were still married and separated really not tenable.
Even though now we know that this was a dreadful interview that had been gathered in the most duplicitous way by Bashir of the BBC. At the time, that overused phrase, bombshell, but I mean, that's what it was. Yeah, you had the future queen, as she still then was, effectively calling into question the line of succession, and that just couldn't happen. I mean, this situation was no longer sustainable, to use a modern word, and so the Queen very reluctantly decided this marriage has to end.
30 years apart, both Diana and her mother had fought against the establishment in different ways, but perhaps Frances realised this time her daughter wouldn't lose.
Frances told me a few years later that she was sort of thrilled at the way that Diana sort of freed herself, as she saw it, from the shackles of royalty and from being a member of the royal family and striking out on her own.
Yes, she was parting company with the oldest and arguably most sort of powerful institution in the land, but she was not going to be cowed and told what to do and how to behave. And you see that in Frances as well, someone who was determined to live life and lead life on her own terms.
After the trauma of Frances's divorce and custody trial, she escaped the claustrophobia of establishment London. She'd married Peter Shand Kidd, and they travelled to the remote island of Seal in Scotland to start a new life.
In London, she was part of the societal scene, and on Seal, it was a completely different change of life. It was a small island with a bridge that literally went over the Atlantic, but space, and she could breathe, and people treated her as she was. They weren't interested in her title or her background. She was treated as one of the community, and she was loved and valued for that. And she said she found herself in Scotland.
Over the years, Diana came to love the visits to see her mother on this remote island.
Such was the informality of being at Frances's house. I stayed there. We had some very, very entertaining, weekends there with William and Harry. It was real swallows and Amazons country, I mean, the kids loved it. And there was nothing grand about where Frances lived. It was barely any furniture there, but it was fun. And Diana liked it because of the isolation and the fact that we managed to escape the media there. So we were able to sort of really give Diana and her mother the freedom to be normal in that sense.
But unlike her own mother, Lady Fermoy, during Frances's divorce, rather than turn against her daughter, when Diana's marriage broke down, Frances was very clear where her loyalties lay.
We all sat round the dining table, and Frances would say, like any mother would say, how's it going? And of course, the inevitable discussion came up about Diana's relationship with her husband, the Prince of Wales. And, Frances was quite critical of the Prince, the way that he was treating her daughter. But of course, tried the best way possible not to interfere, but at the same time was prepared to give her advice because Diana would ask for it. Frances knew all about divorce and knew about all the complications of dealing with the divorce and where life takes you thereafter. So Frances was, in essence, the perfect person to be alongside Diana, to advise her, an incredible ally.
But if visits to see her mother were happy times for Diana, her trips to see her father at Althorpe couldn't be more different, with the arrival of a very unwelcome stepmother.
Diana confronted her and pushed her so violently that Rain stumbled and fell down a flight of stairs.
Diana was 15 years old when in 1976 her family life was rocked once more, this time with the arrival of an imposing and strong-willed stepmother, Rain Spencer.
Rain was a force of nature. She was beautifully made up, ferociously back-combed hair, and a sort of fixed smile, who'd been a member of the London County Council. And she was definitely a woman who knew her mind.
I think it is important that wives should go abroad with their husbands, and also I do genuinely feel they can make a contribution to business.
She was often called barbed wire around a powder puff. She was quite eccentric, but she had a very good eye for men.
Johnny had met Rain 3 years earlier at a cocktail party.
Johnny was very low when they met, and here was someone who was so alive, you'd think she was plugged in somewhere, really. She would listen as if she'd never heard such beautiful words strung together in a sentence. And she did everything she could to look after him.
But when he introduced her to his children, they weren't so entranced.
She was not popular, I think, really, with Diana and Charles and the other children.
Diana felt Rain was a joke, ridiculous, overdressed. They'd had their father for 8 years, all to themselves after the divorce, and Rain sort of took him away.
Diana said to her face, I hate you for everything you've done to my family.
Diana used to sing Rain, Rain, Go Away, but she never said the second sentence, which is come again another day.
But it was at the wedding of Diana's brother that Diana's anger towards her stepmother finally exploded over Rain's treatment of her own mother, Frances.
Charles Spencer's wedding, Diana's brother, was at Althorpe House, and he wanted his family there, but it did throw up all sorts of complications. In many ways, the omens were not good. The heavens opened that day. I was there reporting on it. I remember everybody getting absolutely drenched. Against all that, the domestic disharmony between Lord Spencer's first wife and his current wife just added to the whole drama of the event.
Frances attended the wedding alone. Just over a year before, she and Peter Shankidd had parted ways, their marriage unable to survive the media scrutiny that being Diana's mother and stepfather brought.
It was a big step for Frances to go back into the bosom of the Spencer family, and it must have been an ordeal for her in many ways to sit in that church alongside the woman who had married the man she had married herself 30 years earlier.
During the wedding rehearsal, tensions came to a head.
What happened? Well, nothing much happened at all, because Rain steadfastly refused to address a single word to Frances, and Frances sat there not addressing a word to Rain. Diana was livid because of what Diana perceived to be Rain's hostility towards her own mother, Frances. Diana confronted her and shouted at her and pushed her so violently that Rain stumbled and fell down a flight of stairs.
I think she felt very protective towards her mother, one, coming on her own, and two, being sort of left as an outcast. And she must have done that because she could see that her mother was suffering.
Frances later said that in all her life she couldn't remember ever an occasion where anyone had ever stood up for her quite the way that Diana did on that occasion.
Diana's relationship with Rain was strained, but in 1992, a shared tragedy began to bring them together when Diana's beloved father, Earl Spencer, died.
It was meant to be the perfect family holiday. This was the day
Diana received the news of Johnny's death when she and Charles had united for a rare family skiing holiday in Austria.
The news was then broken to the press party by a Buckingham Palace spokesman.
That the Princess of Wales' father died late this afternoon.
I remember meeting Diana in her room in the Arlberg Hotel and, telling her about her father's death. She was, crying when you would do, and you felt terribly sorry for this person. Suddenly it wasn't the Princess of Wales. It was a woman that was really upset and distressed the fact that she'd lost her father. And the natural reaction for me, I just literally sort of on the bed sort of gave her a hold and a hug. And I said, look, I'm sorry. I'm very, very sorry. And then at that point realized, what I was doing and who she was. You know, she loved her father in the same way that she loved her mother, despite all the happenings in her early life.
And as Diana grieved, her attitude towards her stepmother began to shift.
Official funeral procession made the short journey from Althorpe House to church.
One of the things about the Spencer family is there's lots of powerful women. So I think that once Johnny dies, there's no fighting over him.
The Princess of Wales, head bowed throughout, hid behind sisters and friends.
I think that Johnny Spencer was ailing for some time, and I think Rain tried to make his end really comfortable, because she marries him and then he has a stroke, and so for much of the marriage she's looking after an invalid, and she certainly was a very good wife to him. So I think once Diana sees, you know, how difficult marriage is, and once she moves into a different phase, she maybe begins to appreciate Rain more.
As Diana faced the breakdown of her own marriage, Rain became not just a stepmother, but a valued and impartial friend.
Diana wrote her a letter and Rain responded, and they became very close in the last year or so of her life.
One of the problems that Diana had was that her comings and goings would often be reported. I think that Rain was probably somebody that didn't repeat things that Diana said.
Diana was going through a very difficult time when she would just suddenly cut a friend off for no apparent reason. And Rain was very patient with her ups and downs.
And there was another reason Diana's relationship with Rain grew stronger. Her bond with her own mother was about to implode.
Diana's reaction was one of fury, absolute fury. She was angry beyond words at what her mother had done.
She's here now.
August 1996. Diana and Charles's marriage was officially over. The divorce was made final. But unlike her mother, Frances, who fled the scandal of her marriage breakdown to Scotland, Diana became the focus of even greater scrutiny. And whilst she was keen to avoid the media glare, little did she know her mother was about to thrust her even more firmly into it. In May 1997, Frances agreed to do an interview and photo shoot for Hello magazine.
They'd offered to pay a very large sum of money for a church project she was promoting, and she said, yes, okay, I'll do it. What neither Frances nor, I suspect, any of her family realized was quite how wide-ranging the interview would be.
In the article, Frances opened up about her daughter having her royal title removed.
Frances said it was wonderful that she'd lost her HRH title and that she could be herself and have her own true identity. Apparently that didn't go down too well with Diana, who didn't agree.
Diana's reaction to her mother's interview was fury, absolute fury. She was enraged at what her mother had done, betraying in her eyes family secrets, talking about her. This wasn't just anybody, it was her mother.
But in the end, Frances was doing nothing different from what Diana had been doing endlessly for years, what Charles did. Why shouldn't Frances have her own voice?
But for Diana, her mother's decision to talk so publicly was a betrayal of trust.
As far as Frances was concerned, there were a series of increasingly angry phone calls, anger coming from both ends, anger from Frances, anger from Diana. It didn't help that Frances also spoke in the course of these bitter conversations about Diana's men friends. This was difficult for Diana. She resented her mother's views, but more than anything, she resented her giving an interview at all. Until eventually, Diana put the phone down on her mother and never spoke to her again.
In the final months of Diana's life, Frances could only watch her daughter from afar.
I think Frances had written, but the letters were returned unopened. I mean, for goodness sake, nobody knew that Diana was going to die.
When Francis was first alerted, it was roughly the same time as officials at Balmoral, about 2 o'clock, and she was asleep in her cottage in Seal.
And a friend had rung her, saying, had she seen the television? And so she switched on to the TV channel, and the accident was playing out.
Diana, Princess of Wales, has been seriously injured in a car accident in Paris.
The phone then started to ring. Her phone was besieged by media. She was almost trapped in a situation that she couldn't take the phone off because she was waiting to hear, but she couldn't hear because reporters or others were ringing her. She was a prisoner in her own home with a daughter that was between life and death, going out of her mind, I would, She was on her own there.
Then she was contacted by a courtier from Balmoral and told that her daughter had indeed died in the car crash, but asked her not to say anything until it had been officially announced, and that was going to be an hour later. And that, for Frances, was, we can only presume, was the longest hour of her life.
At 5:06, the world learnt of the death of Frances's daughter.
From Paris for a short time, and now there is confirmation that Diana, Princess of Wales, has died. She died at 4 a.m. after going into cardiac arrest.
Diana's mother, Mrs. Shand Kidd, on the left, and her daughter, Lady Sarah, on the right.
When Frances and her daughters, Jane and Sarah, arrived at Westminster Abbey, it was almost like the wheel had come full circle. She had married there as a teenager, and now she was coming back again, almost with the same cast of characters. All there who had attended her wedding now were attending her daughter's funeral.
She sent me a fax telling me to light every candle and pray for her and her team of helpers.
There's Mrs. Shand Kidd, who gave the world such a great statement when she heard of her daughter's death. I thank God for the gift of Diana and for all her loving and giving. I give her back to him with my love, pride and admiration, to rest in peace.
Even though Frances and Diana weren't speaking before her death, there's reason to believe Diana never meant to leave their relationship so broken.
Diana made Frances executor of her will, and that made her responsible for guardianship of William and Harry. Frances always highlighted it, saying, if she didn't trust me and think a lot of me as a mother, why would she have made me executor?
The mother, once accused of abandoning her children by the aristocracy, was now left with the responsibility of Diana's boys.
On behalf of your mother and sisters, I pledge that we, your blood family, will do all we can to continue the imaginative and loving way in which you are steering these two exceptional young men.
At the end of the day, of all the people Diana wanted to look after her children, it was her own mother. You can't say more than that, can you?
Diana's funeral thrust Frances into the spotlight, and it marked a new phase. Throughout Diana's life, she seemed to have followed in her mother's footsteps, but after her death, the pattern was reversed.
She found her own life changed. She became much more of a national figure, and she decided to use that for doing good, if you like.
Frances now devoted herself to charity work, regularly helping disabled children travel on pilgrimage to the Catholic shrine at Lourdes.
I think Diana has sort of shown her a path, and she realised, as Diana had done many years earlier, that she might as well use this fame that had come to her to do good with it. And she did spend the remainder of her life doing just that.
Frances died at the age of 68. At her funeral, just as at Diana's, Charles Spencer gave the eulogy. He described Frances as a woman who was afraid of nothing and of nobody. Of Frances and Diana, he said there were the usual tensions between a mother and daughter, who were so alike. Throughout Diana's life, her family history had shaped the decisions she made and the woman she was. From witnessing her parents' unhappy marriage and bitter divorce, and learning of her mother's treatment at the hands of the aristocracy, to the arrival of a stepmother she loathed, but learned to love. And at the end of it all, despite their tempestuous relationship, it was Diana and her mother who shared the closest of bonds.
I just want to finish on the whole aspect of your favourite memories of her.
I think they were when she wasn't known by the world, because I, as her mother, need some part of her. I made her. She grew beneath my heart. And so those memories that I have, which no one else knows about, are the most precious. And don't ask me what they are, because I ain't going to tell you.